I was the only woman in my unit's deployment rotation. When I signed my enlistment papers at 19, I believed the military would be the one institution where performance outweighed perception, where measurable standards mattered more than personality, and where wearing the same uniform erased assumptions before they could take root. I did not enlist to escape hardship. I enlisted because I wanted to test myself against something structured, demanding, and objective. I wanted to earn belonging, not inherit it. Basic training was harsh but fair. Expectations were clear, standards were posted, and consequences were consistent. I was not the fastest runner nor the strongest in my platoon, but I was disciplined and methodical, and that steadiness became my advantage. I learned quickly that some underestimated me because I was smaller and quieter. Yet I also learned that consistency speaks louder than volume. By the time I completed advanced training and reported to my first duty station, I had internalized a rule that guided everything afterward. Do your job so well that doubt has no foundation. My unit specialized in logistics support, which meant our work determined whether operations succeeded even if our names were never attached to headlines. I found satisfaction in that responsibility. Precision mattered. Accountability mattered. I met Emmett during my second week at the unit. He worked with the same calm steadiness I valued, and our professional rhythm developed naturally. We divided responsibilities cleanly, verified each other's work without ego, and focused on results rather than recognition. Respect formed through competence rather than conversation. When word came that our company would deploy, I saw it as an opportunity to accelerate growth. My evaluations were strong, and I had volunteered for additional certifications to increase my value within the section. Yet when the initial deployment roster was released, my name was absent. I approached my supervisor privately, expecting constructive feedback. Instead, I was told the selection was made with unit cohesion in mind. The phrase sounded neutral, but felt elastic, as though it could stretch to justify anything. I was the only woman in my immediate section at the time, and although no one said it outright, I could not ignore the possibility that cohesion was being defined without me in mind. After personnel adjustments, my name was eventually added to the roster, though at the bottom. I told myself placement did not matter as long as I had earned the opportunity. Deployment was relentless. Long hours, extreme heat, and no margin for complacency. I adapted quickly and made no significant errors. However, our platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Harding, began reacting differently to my actions than to those of others. When I identified discrepancies in shipment manifests, I was labeled overly cautious. When male soldiers made errors, they were framed as learning experiences. The defining moment came during a high-stakes resupply operation. I discovered missing equipment listed on the manifest and requested a brief delay to locate it. Harding resisted, concerned about optics. The items were ultimately found in a mislabeled bay, and the convoy departed with only a short delay. In the after-action review, Harding implied that junior personnel lacked confidence in established procedures. He did not use my name, but the message was clear. From that point forward, scrutiny intensified. I was reassigned to less visible tasks and my suggestions were met with skepticism. None of it was overt enough to constitute blatant misconduct, but it was systematic. 3 months into deployment, a higher-level audit uncovered tracking inconsistencies across sections. Although the discrepancies predated my involvement, I was called into a meeting where my work was dissected as though I were the likely cause. I had to present timestamps, digital logs, and documentation demonstrating who accessed systems and when. That night, sitting alone in my narrow housing unit, I faced a decision that felt heavier than any field gear I had carried. I could remain silent and hope time corrected perception, or I could formally challenge the narrative forming around me, knowing that doing so could intensify resistance. For the first time since enlisting, I questioned whether performance alone was enough to protect integrity. The audit report itself did not assign direct blame, but it recommended leadership review and corrective training, which gave Harding room to shape interpretation internally. Within days, I was assigned public remedial sessions on inventory procedures I had already mastered. The implication was subtle, but unmistakable. I complied without protest, taking notes and completing exercises with precision. Yet the optics were damaging. At the same time, I was removed from high-visibility assignments and placed in back-end reconciliation roles that limited exposure to decision-making. Each change was defensible on its own, but collectively they positioned me as someone who required supervision rather than someone who led effectively. Performance evaluations soon followed. Harding's draft described me as technically proficient, but requiring close supervision in dynamic environments. The statement contradicted documented evidence from deployment. Allowing it to stand would affect promotions and future assignments. I requested a formal counseling session and presented specific mission outcomes I had managed independently, supported by documentation. Harding countered with vague references to my communication style, a critique difficult to quantify and easy to weaponize. Informal resolution stalled. After careful consideration, I submitted a formal review request, focusing strictly on discrepancies between documented performance and written evaluation. The act shifted the atmosphere immediately. Some colleagues distanced themselves while others quietly expressed support but avoided visibility. Higher headquarters conducted an inquiry. Data logs, emails, and mission records contradicted the narrative that I required close supervision. The evaluation language was revised to reflect objective performance metrics. Harding responded by increasing reporting requirements on my assignments, extending my workdays and raising pressure. The breaking point came when a system outage delayed a critical shipment during a night shift. I followed contingency procedures, coordinated with the receiving unit, and prevented mission impact. The next morning, Harding circulated an email highlighting the delay without context. Instead of responding defensively, I submitted a comprehensive after-action report detailing the outage, mitigation steps, and confirmation of mission continuity. Higher headquarters commended the proactive handling and recommended standardizing the procedures I had implemented. Shortly thereafter, the evaluation review concluded in my favor. Returning home from deployment should have felt like closure, but reintegration has a way of revealing which tensions were temporary and which were structural. The welcome home ceremony was polished and ceremonial, filled with applause, flags, and families who believed the hardest part was over. Yet inside the company footprint, the same hierarchy resumed its shape, and the same personalities retained their influence. The only difference was that now there was an official paper trail contradicting the narrative Sergeant First Class Harding had tried to construct about me. Promotion season began almost immediately. In the military, promotion is not merely symbolic advancement. It determines authority, responsibility, and long-term viability within the institution. You are evaluated not only on past performance but on perceived potential. That perception, I had learned, can be shaped long before a board ever reviews your file. I met every measurable requirement. My physical fitness scores were competitive. My professional military education was complete, and my deployment evaluation reflected accurate performance. Yet as assignments were distributed in preparation for the promotion board cycle, I noticed something familiar. High visibility leadership. Roles during field exercises were being distributed selectively. I was assigned to support positions rather than primary team lead roles. Even though my experience matched or exceeded that of peers who received those assignments, each decision, examined individually, was defensible. Collectively, they limited my exposure to exactly the experiences promotion boards prioritize. What made it extreme was the subtlety. There were no open statements of doubt or direct accusations. Instead, opportunity narrowed quietly. If I performed well in a support capacity, it would be expected. If I pushed for more responsibility, it could be framed as impatience. Emmett was also preparing for the board. His assignments aligned cleanly with his evaluation history, and his leadership opportunities were straightforward. He never distanced himself from me, nor did he attempt to intervene recklessly. His steadiness grounded me during a period when frustration threatened to cloud judgment. Rather than allow resentment to build, I scheduled a meeting with the company executive officer. I approached the conversation analytically rather than emotionally. I presented a structured overview of my completed qualifications, deployment contributions, and current responsibilities. Then I asked a simple question. What specific experiences would strengthen my promotion packet? The executive officer reviewed my record carefully. He acknowledged that my documented performance supported advancement and noted that recent assignment distribution did not fully reflect my capabilities. Without criticizing Harding directly, he recommended that I be placed in a more visible leadership role for the upcoming multi-unit training exercise. The reassignment was official, documented, and difficult to reverse. The training exercise itself was complex, involving coordination between logistics, transportation, and communications elements. Equipment manifests spanned hundreds of line items. Timelines overlapped with minimal margin for delay. As lead coordinator, I was responsible not only for execution, but for anticipating failure points before they materialized. I built layered contingency plans and conducted rehearsals that walked through worst-case scenarios rather than ideal conditions. Preparation consumed long hours, but thoroughness became protection. On execution day, severe weather moved through the training area unexpectedly. High winds grounded air movement. Saturated terrain restricted vehicle access and communications. Lines experienced intermittent disruption. The situation demanded rapid adaptation. Rather than escalate every decision upward, I assessed constraints, redistributed assets, and documented deviations in real time. The exercise concluded with objectives met despite environmental challenges. During the after-action review, senior leadership analyzed performance metrics and mitigation strategies. The captain specifically highlighted adaptive coordination and documentation processes that preserved mission integrity. My role was acknowledged formally in the summary. Harding remained composed but restrained. He could not contest measurable success delivered under visible oversight. Promotion results were released 1 month later. Both Emmett and I were selected. Standing in formation as our names were announced, I felt the weight of more than rank. The promotion represented validation not simply of performance, but of resilience. Yet advancement introduced a new layer of responsibility. As a newly promoted non-commissioned officer, I inherited leadership over a small team that included junior soldiers who had witnessed the prior year's tension. Leadership required balance. I needed to enforce standards without replicating the dismissiveness I had experienced. The first serious test came when one of my soldiers approached me privately to report ongoing inappropriate comments from a senior specialist in another section. The remarks were subtle enough to be dismissed publicly but persistent enough to erode confidence. She hesitated to escalate formally, fearing social consequences. Listening to her account, I recognized the internal calculation she was making. The same one I had once made. But this time I held rank. I initiated formal counseling procedures aligned precisely with regulation. When advised informally to resolve it quietly to avoid unnecessary paperwork, I declined. Informality protects comfort more than it protects integrity. Documentation protects people. The process triggered review. Statements were gathered, and patterns emerged that extended beyond the initial complaint. The outcome included formal reprimand and mandatory corrective training for the specialist. More importantly, it established a precedent within the company. Professionalism was enforceable, not optional. By the end of my first year as a non-commissioned officer, measurable indicators within my team improved. Error rates declined and retention stabilized. Morale surveys reflected trust in leadership. The data did not exaggerate. It confirmed consistency. 2 years later, our unit was selected for a joint overseas mission, supporting Allied forces in a newly activated theater. The assignment required experienced non-commissioned officers capable of building functional logistics systems under uncertain conditions. My name appeared on the selection list along with Harding's. The mission's prestige made refusal unrealistic. It offered strategic visibility, multinational coordination experience, and career-defining impact. Declining would signal hesitation. Accepting meant re-entering an operational environment under leadership that had once attempted to undermine my credibility. Preparation was extensive. Cultural training emphasized diplomatic nuance. Joint planning exercises expose differences. In allied tracking systems, my responsibility would be to integrate multiple supply chains into a unified platform without disrupting national protocols. Upon arrival in the theater, infrastructure limitations exceeded initial projections. Communications networks were unreliable and local contracting systems operated under unfamiliar regulatory frameworks. Establishing order required precision and adaptability. Harding responded to uncertainty by tightening control. He issued directives rapidly, sometimes without consulting technical leads. Speed often overshadowed system compatibility. I began noticing inconsistencies during integration of allied shipment data into our tracking system. The incompatibilities risked duplicating inventory entries, which could distort resource visibility across multiple operational zones. I presented structured analysis demonstrating the technical risks and recommended phased implementation with validation checkpoints. Harding dismissed the concerns as excessive caution and directed immediate integration. The decision created cascading complications. Within weeks, duplicate entries generated inflated supply reports. Commanders relying on those reports began requesting redistribution of assets that did not physically exist in the quantities reflected digitally. The discrepancy threatened operational readiness. Rather than challenge Harding publicly, I compiled a comprehensive technical brief outlining data anomalies, projected consequences, and corrective options. I included timestamped system logs and cross-referenced allied inputs. The documentation was irrefutable. I submitted the brief through official channels, copying the Joint Task Force liaison responsible for interoperability oversight. The response was swift. A joint review panel convened to assess system integrity. During the review, my analysis was validated by allied technical officers who had experienced similar discrepancies. The panel recommended immediate phased correction and credited the identification of the issue to internal monitoring protocols I had implemented. Harding's directive was effectively overridden. The corrective implementation required long hours of reconciliation, manual verification, and diplomatic coordination with allied counterparts. I led the remediation effort, ensuring transparency at every stage. The process restored accurate visibility within weeks. The most extreme element of the conflict was not technical failure. It was the realization that preserving image had nearly compromised multinational operational readiness. The stakes extended far beyond personal reputation. In the months that followed, Joint Command began referencing our theater's corrected integration model as a case study in multinational logistics adaptation. My role was formally documented in mission summaries distributed across command channels while Harding's influence narrowed. He could not openly challenge validated outcomes, and higher oversight limited unilateral decision-making. The environment shifted from controlled hierarchy to accountable collaboration. The mission concluded successfully. Systems stabilized and allied coordination improved measurably. Upon redeployment home, our theater received commendation for adaptive integration under constrained conditions. By the time we returned from the joint overseas mission, my understanding of leadership had shifted from theory to lived experience. I no longer measured success solely by evaluations or rank insignia. I measured it by system stability, by the development of junior soldiers, and by whether the environments I influenced became more resilient after I left them. That shift in perspective mattered, because the most difficult chapter of my career was still ahead. Within months of redeployment, organizational restructuring began across the brigade. Budget adjustments, shifting operational priorities, and leadership rotations created instability. Units were consolidated and command teams changed. With restructuring comes opportunity, but it also creates power vacuums where influence can expand unchecked. Harding was reassigned as acting first sergeant for our company during the transition period. The position gave him expanded authority over personnel actions, discipline, and internal evaluations. It also placed him at the center of decision-making during a time when policies were being rewritten and oversight temporarily thinned. At first, the changes appeared procedural. Counseling requirements were updated and performance tracking systems were adjusted. However, Patterns emerged that echoed earlier chapters of my career. Soldiers who questioned inconsistencies found themselves assigned to less desirable rotations. Requests for professional development were delayed without clear explanation. Informal resolution was encouraged in situations where formal documentation would have created accountability. This time, I was no longer a junior soldier navigating ambiguity alone. I was a staff sergeant with documented operational credibility and a team that trusted me. The breaking point came when a highly competent junior non-commissioned officer, under my supervision, was removed from consideration for an advanced leadership course despite meeting all eligibility criteria. The justification cited incomplete readiness indicators, yet her records showed full qualification. When I reviewed the documentation, I found vague language inserted into her internal assessment language, similar to what had once appeared in my own draft evaluation years. I requested clarification through official channels and was advised to avoid escalating routine personnel adjustments. The phrase was meant to discourage inquiry without outright denying my request. Instead of arguing emotionally, I began compiling comparative data. I gathered eligibility metrics for all soldiers nominated for the course and mapped objective criteria against final selections. The discrepancies were clear. I presented the data to the company commander during a scheduled readiness review, framing it as a procedural consistency concern rather than a personal accusation. The commander, newly assigned and not yet entrenched in existing dynamics, requested further documentation. As personnel files were examined more closely, patterns surfaced across multiple soldiers, not just within my team. Informal modifications to assessments had disproportionately affected those who had previously raised procedural questions or requested formal documentation in sensitive matters. The investigation reached battalion level. Harding maintained composure, arguing that leadership discretion allowed flexibility in evaluating intangibles. However, when confronted with side-by-side comparisons of objective metrics and subjective language, the inconsistencies were difficult to justify. The situation escalated beyond internal correction. A formal command climate assessment was initiated, involving anonymous surveys and external interviews. Soldiers described hesitation to report concerns formally due to fear of stalled advancement. Others cited subtle discouragement when requesting documented counseling instead of informal resolution. The findings did not accuse Harding of overt misconduct, but they identified a pattern of discretionary authority being applied unevenly in ways that affected career progression. He was removed from the acting first sergeant position pending reassignment. The announcement was clinical and brief, delivered without spectacle. For me, the most intense moment was not his reassignment. It was the realization that the cycle had finally broken. The junior non-commissioned officer under my supervision was reinstated as a course nominee. She completed the training with distinction. Her advancement became one of several quiet victories that reinforced a broader cultural shift within the company. The environment changed incrementally. Informal resolution remained an option, but not a substitute for accountability. Soldiers began seeking mentorship openly rather than cautiously. Emmett, who had observed the restructuring process from a parallel leadership role, later remarked that institutional change rarely happens through dramatic gestures. It happens through persistent alignment with policy and measured insistence on fairness. By the end of that year, I was selected for consideration in the Warrant Officer Accession Program, an opportunity that would transition me into a technical leadership track with expanded influence over operational systems. The application process was rigorous, requiring endorsements, performance summaries, and demonstration of long-term potential. When my packet was submitted, it included deployment commendations, joint mission integration documentation, and performance metrics from my team's sustained improvement. It also included something less tangible but equally powerful: a documented history of procedural integrity. Selection results arrived months later. I was accepted. The letter confirming my accession felt heavier than any award I had received. It represented not only personal advancement, but institutional acknowledgement that leadership grounded in accountability strengthens rather than disrupts. Transitioning into the Warrant Officer Program required leaving behind familiar routines and embracing an expanded scope of responsibility. The role demanded technical mastery combined with strategic advisory. Influence. Warrant officers operate in the space between enlisted execution and commissioned command, translating complexity into clarity. The training pipeline was academically rigorous and operationally demanding. Systems architecture, advanced logistics modeling, risk analysis, and cross-functional coordination filled my days. Unlike earlier phases of my career where credibility was contested, this environment evaluated competence through objective performance and peer-reviewed assessment. For the first time, I felt unburdened by narrative. Graduation from the program marked not just rank change, but identity evolution. I returned to operational units as a technical authority responsible for ensuring system integrity across multiple companies. My recommendations influence procurement decisions, data integration protocols, and contingency planning structures. Years after the first deployment conflict, I found myself briefing senior officers on standardized tracking systems derived directly from the corrective measures I had once defended under scrutiny. The procedures had been codified into formal doctrine updates. What began as a defensive act to protect my credibility had evolved into institutional best practice. Harding's career path diverged quietly. He remained within the organization, but in roles with limited personnel authority. There was no public downfall or dramatic reversal. Instead, influence recalibrated to align with documented performance trends. The most satisfying resolution was not his reassignment or my advancement. It was cultural change. Within my sphere of influence, documentation was no longer viewed as antagonistic. It was foundational. Junior soldiers were trained to understand regulations deeply enough to navigate them confidently. Leadership counseling emphasized measurable criteria. Transparency replaced ambiguity. One afternoon, years into my warrant officer role, I observed a young specialist challenge a procedural inconsistency during a planning meeting. Her tone was professional, her documentation thorough, and her confidence steady. The room did not tense. No one dismissed her caution as overcomplication. The discussion centered on risk mitigation and system integrity. Looking back, the conflict that once felt personal now appears structural. It was a confrontation not between individuals, but between transparency and unchecked discretion. The frustration was extreme because it threatened not only my career, but the integrity of processes affecting many others. The resolution was satisfying. Not because someone lost, but because the system strengthened. When I first enlisted, I believed effort alone guaranteed respect. Experience taught me that effort must be documented, defended, and sometimes fought for within established channels. Strength is not defiance for its own sake. It is disciplined persistence anchored in regulation and principle. Standing in uniform now, years removed from the young private who once questioned whether performance was enough, I understand something. Clearly, leadership is not about never facing resistance. It is about ensuring that resistance refines systems rather than diminishes people.